Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Chris Shang, and today we have Ben Zettler, who is the founder of Zettler Digital. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
I appreciate for having me on. I'm really excited to be here and hope to share some exciting insights for your listeners.
Absolutely. First off, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what Zettler is and what you guys do and the kind of companies that you guys are working with?
Absolutely. So we are a digital marketing e-commerce agency. We focus on three core areas of expertise. We work with folks on optimizing their Shopify websites. We support folks with email and SMS marketing, and we also help folks with advertising, primarily with Facebook and Instagram ads and Google ads.
Got it.
As far as folks that we've had the opportunity to work with, we're fortunate to have long-standing partnerships with the core platforms that tie into our service. We are Shopify Plus partners, and that's sort of the highest level tier we can call it within their partner program. And similarly, we are Klaviyo Elite partners, and Klaviyo has grown tremendously over the course of the last 8 years and supported a lot by the growth of Shopify. But we've worked with a lot of very cool businesses. I guess to name drop a few, Slam Magazine, Bleacher Report, Levin Bakery, Marquesa, Promix, Mariano Rivera, a pretty healthy mix, I'd say, of different types of businesses, different sizes of businesses. Really anybody that's selling a product online, or even if they're not, like I said, we worked with Mariano and a few other athletes. There's ways that we can certainly work with them, and it's been an exciting ride so far.
Very cool. Um, Definitely have a lot of questions around how the landscape has been evolving. I think it's been a pretty exciting time for the past couple of years, and especially this year. But before we do that, we'd love to kind of get your story in terms of how you got involved into this space in the first place, right? I think I saw that you come from a sports background, and then you got into creating your own consumer brand as well. But how did you end up in this world of performance marketing, which I think is like segue into starting your own e-commerce brand?
Yeah. Well, first was out of necessity. So I didn't have a job out of well, I'm kind of burying the lead. So I had a job out of school, out of college. I at first I worked for the University of Maryland baseball team, and I worked there as an undergrad, and then I stayed on for a season, hence the Maryland jersey sitting behind me, or whichever way I got to go. Stayed on for a season. This was back in 2013, but it was only a one season gig. This was post graduating, and after that, I had a job lined up for the executive development program at Macy's. And it was the only job I had, only offer that came through. So that's sort of what I took. But what it required was 2 years of working in a department store, as sort of it's a training program, as a means to then moving on to eventually a corporate job in whatever, function or capacity, might be fit for you. Um, I lasted 2 days. It was the first thing in my life that I quit. It was just, you have one of those moments where you're not where you want to be, and you make a change. And during that time, after quitting that job, I decided to start a business. I started a sunglasses company that I always say I got very lucky because I started that business. I started the website on Shopify, after researching different options out there. And at the time, this was 11 years ago, um, there were other options, I guess, to make. And I did land on Shopify. And then Shopify has gone through its rapid growth phase over the last,
Mhm.
7 years or so. And so it was definitely the right choice to make. But that was the first piece. That was the first taste, I'll call it. And as that business grew, I was fortunate enough actually to sell the company in 2018. But as that business grew, a friend of a friend is looking for help with building a website or running advertising or doing email marketing or doing social media. And it just kind of became this domino effect, really, of helping this person and helping that person, and then building a portfolio online, and then joining the Shopify partner program, and then MailChimp really emerges, and Klaviyo really emerges, and advertising really emerges. And it's just this kind of thing that has snowballed over time,
Right.
not necessarily with, at least in when it started, with real intention. And then the other piece for me, and this is something I talk about a lot with potential clients, is I also worked for a large scale e-commerce company for a long time prior to making this my full-time endeavor, I worked for a company called Steiner Sports, which is the largest autographed sports memorabilia company of its kind in the world, up until it being bought out by Fanatics a few years ago. And I was the company's first full-time hire dedicated to social and digital marketing. I took what was a 50,000 follower cumulative following to over 2.5 million in our first couple of years there. And that in itself really led to my role expanding within the business because it had such an impact across other areas like email marketing in particular. But eventually I oversaw not just social, but email, paid advertising, affiliate marketing, and eventually our entire e-commerce operation. Up until the point of that buyout, and then that's when I took this agency life that has, I guess, I've created for myself full time, and haven't really looked back since.
Got it. You mentioned in your explanation a couple of instances of, going out and starting your own thing and taking the entrepreneurial leap. First one being the sunglass brand, right? And so I think you kind of glazed over that, but like that's kind of a big step, right? Like you go into a corporate job, you last a couple of days, you're like, screw this, and then you're not built for that. I mean, but it's also got to be a big amount of, I mean, I don't know, it depends. Maybe like based on the age you were at the time, you're maybe ignorance is bliss. I don't know. Tell us about that. But like, what was that journey like to make the decision to leave this? And what did that feel like where you knew that that was not for you, that corporate job? And then going and starting this sunglass brand, how did that decision happen? And I know you probably learned a ton from that experience and that trial by fire, which then led you to becoming the expert go-to guy from your circle of friends. And that gives you an opportunity to learn more and try and experiment a lot more different things and then evolve, get a new skill set, go back to a larger organization, test out those skill sets. And now it makes your confidence to leap into the second chapter of entrepreneurship of this agency make a lot more sense, I think. But can you walk us through that first experience, which I feel like there's probably a lot more to it than just how fast we went through it.
Yeah, no, 100%. I always wanted to work in sports. At one point in my life, I think maybe, oh, I was going to be a sports agent. And then I realized, well, I probably got to go to law school. And it's like, I don't want to go to law school. I don't want to do that extra, 3 years of school. I had enough at that point. Um, and then I thought, okay, in some capacity, maybe I'll work for a team or I'll work for a league or I'll do, something. And when that didn't happen, and then I found my, self like working in a department store and thinking, okay, what's the next couple of years of my life going to look like? It was a very low moment for me, frankly. And so low that, like I said, I quit something for the first time ever. Um, and even saying this out loud on a podcast, I've only recently actually started to talk about that publicly, maybe within the last year or two, that yeah, I had this thing and I quit. The process of creating the business, like very much like the agency now, even starting the sunglasses company, it was like, okay, what do I have to do today to sort of make something happen? Then what do I have to do tomorrow to make something happen? It wasn't, I didn't have to make the largest of investments in the world in order to get something going, thankfully. And also too, it's worth pointing out, like, this isn't like I sold the business and had some like multi-million dollar windfall. Like, that's not what it was. It was more so, uh, I always look at it as a testing ground to giving the experience necessary to ultimately do it for, all the different brands that we work with. But, I spent that first summer about 3 months going back and forth with suppliers on Skype in Taiwan and China and Korea, all these different places to try to find the right one. I actually eventually found um, these folks that sent me samples. They were the factory that um, make the sunglasses for a very prominent player in the space now, one that had kind of started around the same time as us, and then eventually did have that multi-million dollar exit a couple of years ago, which is very great for them. But I found a supplier, was dealing with them like on at night for the most part over the course of those first 3 months. I'd gotten another job prior to working at Steiner Sports at a PR firm in New York. And so doing this on nights, weekends, building out a website, getting a Shopify account, like understanding the ins and outs of the platform, doing things that over the course of those 3 months, today I could probably finish the whole thing of what that was in 2 hours, easily, without exaggeration. Just um, yeah, it's kind of one of those things like you're a little naive. You don't know what you don't know. You try to work through things. Things take longer than they should for sure. Um, but spent those 3 months building everything out, getting designs, getting samples sent, getting a mold prototype, sent out from the factory I chose in Taiwan back out to us, and then eventually approving that and ordering 3,300 pieces across 11 color iterations for our first run of sunglasses, which was eventually delivered in March 2014, and then launching shortly after that. Um, and then it was just kind of this thing that I was doing for, the better part of, it was 5 years, but 4 years of having product. Um, and it was fun. I mean, it was a cool thing to have. It was a nice talking point, I suppose. And um, and I don't know. I mean, that's just it's kind of what it
Yeah.
was.
Well,
Yeah.
what do you, yeah, I mean, I think like the way even that you describe it though is so different than I think a lot of, younger people would think about when they are talking about the idea of starting an e-commerce brand, right? I think there's this idea of perfectionism and this idea of like, it's gotta be like this, and this is my vision, and there's a lot of ego into the conversation. And the way that I see you're describing it is like, I'm gonna use this as like a testing ground, like a way for me to learn the nuts and bolts of how to start an e-commerce brand so that I can take this skill set and evolve it over time.
Yeah,
And
you know what? I don't know if I don't think I thought that
that,
intentionally
yeah.
in at the time. I look back on it, it's like, okay, great. Like this is what I sort of learned. At the time, I think I completely lacked direction, to be honest
Mm,
with you. Like I don't think I didn't necessarily like look at it exclusively as a testing ground, but at the same time, I didn't like have some strategic approach that was like, okay, here's how we're going to scale this business to doing millions of dollars a year or whatever it might be. Like it was just like, okay, I'm doing this thing and might be able to make a little money. And here's how I can do it. And, that business was entirely built, and this is something I glossed over, but that business was entirely built on influencer marketing, which at the time that wasn't even like a phrase.
mhm,
But Instagram was around for a few years, but still emerging, still rapidly growing, millions and millions of accounts every month. And so it was very easy, whether a business or a personality creator, like you could grow a page and partner with others and promote a product and do all these things and not really have to outlay any cash. Like very, very different than what you have to do now for not nearly even as much reach. But
mhm,
folks now that have 5, 6, 10 million followers on their pages that might charge you tens of thousands of dollars to do something that might get you a negligible amount of sales. We were sending free product to those same exact people that were posting on our behalf and driving, a couple $1,000s in revenue at a pop. And it was great. It was really great. Like it was kind of the wild west of influencer marketing.
mm,
And and so it came at the right time, I suppose, because if I tried to do that now, like I don't think I'd have the stomach for making the level of investment that I'd have to make between content and paying out to creators and frankly just like the actual costs of producing product, especially in a post-COVID world. Um, so I had a lot of those things were, in hindsight, pretty big positives. But to go back to the to your note, like, there wasn't much intention with it. It's just kind of, all right, here's what it kind of did, and here's what I kind of learned now that it happened, and how can that be applied to what we might be doing for clients that we're working with.
yeah. I mean, I think there's something to be said though, that if you can execute now in a couple of hours what took you a few months to do, like you learned quite a bit through that experience,
Oh
regardless
yeah.
of whatever the intent was in the original process. But I also think you bring up a good point, which is I think like, to try to do that now and try to stomach through it now. Obviously you see a lot of people talking about how easy it is to start something like an e-commerce brand, but I also think it's just that it's so much more challenging because there's so much noise out there to differentiate, and the opportunity to scale something up is a lot more difficult, requires more resources and more time to do it, probably to get to the point where you got to even nowadays. That being said, would love to kind of just now dive into from an agency perspective. Yeah, you talked about influencer marketing and being involved in that for that brand and how that landscape has changed. But what else has really changed in, the better part of close to a decade of being in e-commerce and performance marketing? What's kind of been the things that you've seen go through the different cycles of being popular and then not being so popular anymore? And I think that's probably like the nature of running an agency too, is like you're constantly trying to figure out what's going to be the next thing as algorithms change, as technology changes, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of different things happening right now across just tech, right? And how people are discovering things. I think even through like social platforms, I think, we're seeing this lean in towards people buying on social platforms, right? Like buying on TikTok stores and things like that. And I don't even think it's hit like its peak, but that's where these other generations are going to probably be buying in the next 5 years, versus Googling something or even on Amazon, right? So curious to your thoughts on that, and where has been the biggest changes that you've seen in the past couple of years to today?
What we offer and how we package services has gone through many different transitions over the past few years as technology has changed, as social algorithms have changed, as consumer behavior has changed. And so it's really interesting to think back, you know, 5, 6 years ago, the services that we were most commonly offering to merchants and how we would ultimately go about executing those services is so significantly different. Like, for example, 5, 6 years ago, we would take on a lot of engagements for organic social, which was kind of my bread and butter because that's what I was doing at my full-time job, and it just sort of like made sense. And um, we've done less of that lately, even though we still do, but less of it lately because of the reliance on content in social, like video content, that we're not a creative studio. And there's some agencies that are, and that might build stuff for merchants that they're working with. Or there's certain instances where maybe now we might be managing a group of creators that are creating content for a brand if the brand isn't doing that themselves. Um, but there is so much more involved in ultimately garnering interest and generating a following and building this group of um, engaged brand evangelists that to do that in 2024 versus like 2014 to like 2016, 2017 is just so different. Um, and with that, you see even a big split between the brands that do dedicate the resources to that and then the brands that don't. And the brands that don't concentrate just super heavily on like paid marketing and site optimization work. And there's still an element of content that you need to crew and when you're doing that at a certain level of scale. But then you see like a lot of businesses that maybe aren't necessarily as savvy, or maybe their product isn't as sexy or whatever it is. And they kind of struggle in building that content library and using that across all of their marketing. There's been some, um, and also too, I should mention, like part of that change is like the change in social algorithms, like the ability to grow, like how easy it may have been. Easy is a relative term, but easy then compared to now for growing an Instagram following or growing a Facebook following, or even now today, growing a TikTok following versus a year or two ago. Um, it is so different than what it used to be. And that's always going to be natural for the growth of any social platform. There's been a couple of other key growth moments for us from a services perspective, but in just how the landscape has changed. So, for example, when Apple implemented iOS 14.5, and that was the big thing at the time. that totally changed the growth trajectory of um, social advertising performance, like Facebook being sort of like the biggest piece of that, but really for any platform, where on the services side, a lot of brands started to shift away from like, well, I can't get paid advertising right anymore. Like, oh wait, email marketing is still here. Email marketing is not dead. Email marketing's been around for 20 years. Like, let's put more of an emphasis there. Um, and then the combination of that with COVID happens, and there's more merchants that are there, and there's less money, and there's, we're spending less on customer acquisition and trying to get users who we already have kind of in our world to buy more. And so then email. I feel like over the last 4 or 5 years, like email and just own marketing in general has gone through this massive transition. And those were some really key growth moments for Klaviyo as a platform, for example, like where we're heavily involved from a partnerships perspective. And um, I think brands of all sizes now put a very different emphasis on their own marketing in a positive way. Um, but it's always interesting too, like when you see like a brand that they're spending 50 grand a month maybe in paid advertising, but they won't pay for the $150 a month tool that can help enhance the data that's funneling into their advertising or funneling into their email marketing. But yeah, I think as an agency, there are constantly changes to how things work and what works and what technologies are out there that you have to remain informed on so that you can make recommendations for merchants where something might be relevant for them. And ultimately then we sort of integrate those things into our processes from a services perspective.
Yeah, lots of great information in there. Uh, you mentioned that, from a, I mean, this is more so for today and then going into the near future, but like there's so many new technologies, lots of obviously AI stuff that I think, especially this year is, a lot of over promising, I think like under delivering in terms of like what some of these AI technologies are doing. Uh, but that being said, you know, how much are you noticing this? You mentioned this example of a company that'll spend like 50,000 on Facebook ads, but then won't like spend the 150 to clean up the data, as part of them to optimize their performance or what have you. I know that we went from this shift of just like output, like performance, the idea of performance marketing is like directly tied to an output, right? And then
Mhm.
optimizing for that output. But I think we've also seen attention become much more challenging to get. And there feels, at least like in my world, this need to be able to build more trust with the audience and the consumer audience. And that requires a little bit um, more resources to spend on a longer sales cycle than they typically would like. How do you see that, or do you notice that at all, where it's this, there is a more of a prerequisite to be able to leverage multiple channels as part of the engagement process with a potential customer before they actually convert now versus how it used to be?
Yes. Yes, across the board. Yes, in terms of uh, costs have risen simply for a brand to convert a user, and being, I think the term omnipresent gets a little bit overused. Like you don't have to be like as active as you could be across every single channel for every brand. Different channels are going to work differently for you, but to have a presence in advertising and to have a presence in your own marketing and to funnel through consistent messaging across your website and also kind of do the same on organic social and have all these like different pieces sort of talking to each other to ultimately get somebody to make that first purchase. That is definitely emphasized way more than um, you know 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it's like, let's just run up a budget on Facebook ads and keep converting users at less than $10 cost per order and just keep rolling. That just doesn't exist anymore.
Mhm.
But the second piece I would say too is for us as an agency and how we sell services to the clients that we work with and how they like those like kind of business to business, the folks that we're dealing with are making decisions about hiring us or someone else. That too has completely changed. And maybe that's reflective of just um, the economy or whatever it might be. But I've had so many conversations with folks over the course of the last year in talking about how there seems to have been a very specific yet undefined shift in terms of how brands are evaluating agencies and bringing them on. I couldn't even tell you the amount of conversations that I've had over the last 10 years where something could have been a one call close, get on a phone call. All right, great. This is what we need. This is what you offer. This is how much you're going to charge. Great. Let's hire you. Um, Whereas now, it's been a very interesting and I'll dare I say difficult fight when going through a sales process to pitch a merchant, and now they want free audits of all of their marketing, and the idea that they should have to pay someone for taking 10 to 15 hours of their and their team's time to ultimately evaluate pieces of their business and then give recommendations for how to better their business is like, it's like sacrilegious. It's like, how dare you consider charging me for something like that? And it's a real problem in our industry, to be honest with you. I mean, I in the last year, we've probably had, I'd say, uh, this is not a precise number, but anywhere from like 5 to 10 different opportunities at different levels of scale in terms of what they were looking for from a services perspective, whether that be across different channels or at singular channels, where we've spent time in reviewing what they've got. We did initial calls, we do follow-up calls, we do strategy sessions, we do walkthroughs, we do Loom recordings, we do all these things, only to be told, yeah, we're not going to hire you guys. We're going to go with somebody else. Or only to be told, you know what? We don't have the budget for it. Like, what do you mean? We've been talking for 2 months. Or only to be told nothing and have go through that process and then you never hear from somebody again. And what's so interesting to me, and sorry, I'm going a little bit on the soapbox, not necessarily answering your question,
Okay.
um, but what's interesting to me is that every agency owner I talk to, so everybody I know in my world says the same thing. So it's like we know who we compete with on deals. Like we have good relationships with a lot of folks in my world, and like who are these people hiring that they're going with? And I think in a lot of situations it's no one's actually being hired, and they're just maybe trying to be nice, but they may be taking our advice and running with it, or they're just deciding, what, we're not going to do this, and we're going to kick the can further down the road. So um, it's an interesting time for sure, because again, I think maybe it's economic effects perhaps, or maybe it's just with the way that the industry has matured and brands, rightfully so, are getting smarter about where they're spending their money and what resources they're sort of aligning for their brand. But I think there's challenges both for just selling your product, as well as for the service providers like us that are selling a service to help you sell that product.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like, I ran a growth marketing agency for 7 years before trying to build something more scalable. I get the challenges of trying to scale up a service business. I think like, and tell me what your thoughts are on this. There's a couple of variables, I think, when I've had conversation with agency owners today, which is like, one, I think cost of capitals is more expensive with interest rates. So definitely there's a weight of that and people being very conscientious with every dollar that they spend. I see a lot of like conversations around CFOs being involved in the decision-making process, which isn't necessarily like it hasn't historically been an organic part of that process. And a CFO may not be the best person to evaluate ROI on this, on service businesses, right? But they're still coming into, approved budgets that are even just like, 4 or 5 figures, right? So it's crazy. And then I think the other part of it is just that there's a lot of people, like it's become a more crowded space too, right? With people that don't necessarily know. So you may not be
Yep.
actually competing with your competitors anymore. You're competing with a person who knows how to create a better social media presence for themselves, but may or may not have ever executed at the scale of what you've done, right? And I've seen that a lot. And so for those they're maybe able to kind of come in, undercut pricing and just be like, hey, I think I can deliver on this. And they're leveraging their, their social media, like, uh, visibility as a way of like a proof point, but it's really not. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of some of these brands or companies that are going for some of these like lower cost. um I think it's like more of like a scam because it's not going to be like output based, and they're going to get burned, and you see that happen quite a few times, or it's already happened and they've been
Hmm.
burned by some of these smaller guys and that don't really have the experience or the know how to actually perform. And that's also creating the hesitations. But
Yeah,
yeah,
on that last point, we definitely see that. Even thinking about like the Klaviyo Partner Program, for example, which we've been involved with for 8 years, and at the time that COVID started, there was maybe a few hundred partners, and now there's like I've seen numbers from Klaviyo's team where sometimes they say 5,000, sometimes they say 6,000. Like it's obviously significantly more than what it was before, and so there are definitely a lot. I think there is a lot of that where there's so many providers in the space. There's folks that are going to undercut on price. They don't necessarily have the experience. And, sometimes that's, an opportunity for us to pause and reflect on like, hey, how do we structure things? How do we offer our services? Are we pricing things the proper way? Because maybe somebody's undercutting on price, but it's working and maybe they do know what they're doing.
yeah,
And, then we have to evaluate, okay, how are we structuring things to make sure that we're providing a level of service that makes sense for what that merchant needs and what they're looking for.
yeah, absolutely. On that note, I know we're a little bit over time, but I want to say thank you so much for sharing your insights and your story. Super valuable. Great conversation.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on. If anybody listening has any questions, I'm always happy to engage on social. If you just reach me, it's at Ben Zettler across all major platforms. And again, thank you for having me.
Of course.